How would you describe a visionary, ingenious, original? This man is a laudable example of the same, an astute and skillful businessman who has magically touched lives. 1998 marked the beginning of Exalt, a California headquartered HR and BPO company he founded. Since then, from being the pioneer of human resources BPO for Global 500 corporations, to becoming the co-founder and managing director of Carrick Capital Partners, Jim Madden never shied away from donning different hats. When we look into a crystal ball, the cloudy mist will certainly predict him to be a multifaceted personality with a mission. He has been instrumental in influencing the trajectory of HRO and has contributed to transforming the way HR works. His ability to fight barriers, curiosity to see what the other side has to offer, and never settle attitude has taken him to heights. He's also a brave sailor and an avid skier with a never-ending passion for life. Meet Jim Madden, the gentleman who never fails to make a mark.
Okay, so make no mistake, the world has changed forever. We're all familiar now with COVID-19. It's led to a lot of things, and not many of them pleasant. There's heightened awareness from all of us on health threats, not just COVID-19, but whatever the next one might be. We're all now familiar with shelter in place and lockdowns and economic hardship. In fact, in the United States, in the first basically 60 to 90 days of the lockdown here, there were 19 million jobs lost. It's just a record amount of economic disruption. And in the UK, there's certain parts of England that had an economic GDP drop that wasn't seen since the Middle Ages. And we're also witnessing now a dramatic move to businesses social online. And that's going to have profound impact for individuals, for organizations, corporations, and for HR, which I'm going to focus on for the bulk of the conversation. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the big picture. So there's going to be certain industries and certain sectors who are going to experience long-term economic headwinds, not just right now, but for the foreseeable future, 1, 5, 10 years, perhaps even decades. So if you think about it, leisure, hotels, restaurants, retail, cruise lines are not only, when they're back online and back operating in full, there's going to be a heightened level of consumer awareness. Will the average passenger approach going on a cruise line the same as they did 2 years ago, pre-epidemic? Maybe, maybe not. But the industries really need to think about what those changes mean. There'll be business travel changed. In our own business, we used to fly all over the place. We flew internationally. We would fly to New York week over week to go to board meetings. And what we've now realized in the last 7 months is you can do all this over video, much like we're doing now. So if I'm running a commercial airline, I'm going to need to think about how that's going to change. And basically the people who paid my highest fare now aren't going to be the ones then coming back in large numbers. There's going to be probably a permanent reduction in business travel. In retail, in the United States, large malls have probably had their last hurrah. And then finally, and there's other points, but I just want to hit some highlights here. In commercial real estate, as businesses think about how much they can probably work from home or work remotely on a permanent basis, the required footprint for your office is going to change. Now, on the other side, there's sectors that are going to have tailwinds. They're going to benefit from this, probably in the short term, like we're seeing now, but perhaps forever. And just a few more examples here. So cybersecurity, which probably all of you are familiar with, you have departments that deal with this. It's experienced its fastest growth yet because there's predators who are being viciously attacking through phishing, through all kinds of basically bad behaviors. Online learning, certification, education. If you look at some data as of September, showed 80% year-over-year increases, and there's little decline in sight. And one of the themes I'll talk about is artificial intelligence and machine learning. They were already changing the world. They're going to be changing and having a much more dramatic impact going forward. And we need to think about how human resources is going to be impacted, how it should be in a position to take advantage of all of these trends. So for the rest of the conversation, I'm going to basically divide this into 3 pieces. I'm going to go through a brief history of human resources, and you'll see HR and HCM interchangeably in this presentation. So HCM, human capital management. We're going to talk about what the present looks like, and then we're going to hypothesize, and I'll take out my crystal ball. What does the future might hold for us? So I know there's a lot of information on this slide, and I promise you, I'm not going to go through every word here. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights and see if I can give you a perspective here. So if you go back 40 years, 1979, and probably most of you weren't even born. I was around, actually starting my freshman year in college. There was a software company called Tesseract that was one of the first major products to have payroll run in-house by corporations. It was clunky, it was hard to use, but it was a big start. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, you saw businesses starting to install HR systems, lots of them. There was McCormick and Dodge and MCA, and PeopleSoft came about during that time period. I'll talk in a moment about Exalt and what that did to the industry. But then really, if you look in the last decade plus, what's happened? There's a big, huge move to digital and move to the cloud. Interesting, one of the first to get to the cloud was 6 years ago with SAP's SuccessFactors. Fast forward now, Workday, which is started by the same people who brought us PeopleSoft, is growing and taking market share at least at a 20% clip year over year. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the history about HR BPO from some experience we had in this. So this is the vision that we had of Exalt, and it's hard for me to believe. This was 22 years ago, but it was. This is when we started and launched the company. We had the objective to have a world-class business process outsourcing that focused on best practices, had centers of excellence, used leading third-party tools, and experienced management team. We worked closely with 2 to 3 alpha clients. Alpha meaning they were willing to take and share the risk, and there was economic alignment with them. We would commit to take cost out. We would commit to have any capital avoidance for them. We would put in all of the HR systems for them, and we allowed an opportunity for equity investment in Exalt as well. So we thought we were ambitious in 1998. We had a financial target to get to a revenue run rate of $100 million over 5 years. We wanted to have margins, both gross margins and bottom line margins, that were better than traditional IT outsourcers. Back in the day, there was EDS and there was CSC. Actually, those companies are now part of a larger company called DXC today. We wanted large referenceable clients. Importantly, we didn't want to lose any client. We wanted to keep every client and have 100% referenceability. We were very focused on employee turnover, given we were an HR business. We wanted our turnover well below 20%. So this is a very early pictorial of what it looked like in terms of how we presented to the client. And we wanted to be very, very focused on what we did and what we didn't do. And it was equally important to talk about what we didn't do as much as what we did do. So Exalt's focus was on the part in the period in the middle. It was on process standardization. It was on delivery, multi-shoring, offshoring, nearshoring, and of course on integrated HR applications and management. We work with PeopleSoft, SAP, and a number of other products, in fact, some that aren't even around today. We were very clear with the client that policy, strategy, compliance rested with them. You can't outsource that. You can get advice on that. They needed to own that. In other words, the client made every important decision, and we ran the factory. On the bottom of the pyramid, we were also clear that we weren't in the IT infrastructure or networking business. The client could do that, or they could outsource that with a third party. So now if you take a look at the world of HR processes, and again, this is a 20-plus-year-old chart, and this is, I'm going to show you a chart in a little bit that shows how we think of the world today. So this is quite simple. So keep in mind here, we thought there were 3 major areas: core process management, talent management, and workforce management, and then 9 subcategories within there. And that worked. That was a good definition. So again, keep this in mind, keep that wheel in mind, because I've got a slide that'll show what we really think the HR world looks like today. So what was the pitch to a client? The pitch to an Exalt client was really threefold. It was, we're going to give you bottom line impact. We're going to guarantee cost reduction. We're going to guarantee you don't need to put any money into your HR systems. That will be our job. We're also going to guarantee increased performance, contractual service levels, uptime, productivity, and enablement. And we're going to allow you to focus on the strategic parts of your business and your goals and your HR strategies and people strategies. What did that result in? I know this chart might be a little bit difficult to read, so it's more of the trend than the actual numbers. But if you go back to 2000, we launched with British Petroleum. That was a $600 million 5-year contract. A year later, that was followed by a $1 billion contract with Bank of America to run all of their HR processes globally, which included UK operations. But that predictability, those high quality clients, those brands who partnered with us, allowed us to grow the company to about $500 million in revenues over 6 years, and equally important, become profitable in 3 years from launch. Back in 2004, which is about when we sold the company, I'll talk about that in a minute, what did the HR BPO landscape look like? Well, Exult had about 1/3 of the market share, but there were a lot of players in the space. And keep that in mind too, as we talk about what the market looks like today for players when we get to that. So what happened? In December of 2004, we sold or merged Exult into Hewitt in a transaction valued at about $800 million. And then in October 10, so about 6 years later, Hewitt itself sold to Aon, the insurance broker and advisory services, for a $5 billion transaction. And then more recently, in May of 2017, Blackstone, large private equity firm, acquired Aon's benefits and HR technology business for $5 billion itself, just that part. And what was that? That was the original business of Exult, which continued on with many of its same client contracts, and it was Hewitt's benefits administration business. That business today is known as Alight. Now, let's jump to what do we think the market looks like today? So let me talk about HR leadership, which might be on the minds of a lot in the audience out there. So in the 90s, the most senior HR manager frequently reported to the CFO or the chief administrative officer. In fact, for the client contracts that we signed at Exult, they might have been signed by the HR leadership, but they were equally signed by the chief financial officer or chief administrative officer. And why was that? And I would venture to say that really senior HR leadership didn't really have a seat at the table. And we thought that was a mistake. We worked and aligned with HR. So in the first decade of the new millennium, from 2000 onward, the title Chief Human Resource Officer arose. Now, many of you might have that title today. But originally, this was more focused on resources and the cost aspects of HR. And still, up until 2010, under half reported directly to the CEO, at least among the Fortune 500. So now we have what rise of the Chief People Officer, or CPO, which was a much more common term. So where did this come about? It's hard to exactly say, but we seem to have traced this to a 2015 Harvard Business Review article that said, look, it's time to blow up HR and rethink the way HR services are delivered. Companies, and especially startups, didn't really want to focus on the cost aspects and resources aspects of HR. It wanted to focus on the people and proactively set a culture. And we agree with that. And as a result, HR finally has a seat at the C-suite table. About 2/3 now, from what the data we can see, the heads of HR, CPO in many cases, report directly to the CEO or equivalent, which could be something like an executive chairman. But I would suggest that the ability now of the CPO to recruit, develop, and retain critical talent is probably the single most important function and is going to be paramount in this new world. A lot of you are probably members of HR professional organizations. Just in the US alone, there's about 45. I'm not going to go through the list here, but as you're doing today with this NIAMO hosted conference, the world is changing virtual and online. A lot of the certifications, a lot of the interactions are going to be online, and that also has profound implications. Let's take a look at the HCM market itself. We've picked some data here from Gartner. We could have picked it from a number of different sources. They're actually pretty consistent. But just 2 years ago, in 2018, the HCM space was about a $15 billion market. And in 4 years from now, by 2024, Gartner estimates it's going to be a $26 billion market. You see a blip there where between this 2020, 2021, it goes down to 2% growth, but keep in mind, it's still growing. So it's not declining. Even in very challenged economic times, the HCM space continues to grow. I would actually suggest from data we're seeing now, already it's growing at faster than 2%. And I think the 2% growth in 21 is a very conservative projection. So now remember that slide I had a little while ago that had the circle, the wheel with the 3 major segments and 9 subsegments. This is a pictorial of how we would think of the landscape of HR today. Now, I promise you, I'm not going to go through each hexagon here and kind of tell you all of them mean. I'm just going to cover the major categories and effectively what we think this means here. So the major categories are different colors and parts here, but there's core systems, things like your HRIT system, your system of record. Then there's recruitment pieces. There's talent performance pieces. There's learning, which is probably all going online. There's general HR services. There's a pretty new category now of workforce management. And then you can specialize this on, you see in the lower left, basically any way that makes sense. Different industries have very different requirements for how they think about HR. If I'm in the construction industry, very labor intensive, probably very different than if I'm in financial services or a regulatory services business. I've got different levels of workforce, different HR needs. The interesting thing here, where Exalt 20 years ago tried to cover this entire landscape, and there's still companies that would claim to do all of this today, there are vendors and software providers in every one of these hexagons. And in fact, there's some cases, there are numerous ones. And so they're springing up. It's a very dynamic, very vibrant area. In fact, based on data we've seen, there's over 1,400 HCM companies. But you got to drill into this. And this is something to think about here. More than half have less than $10 million in revenues. And about a fifth, actually probably more than that, have less than 5 million in revenues. And so the implication of that is you got to think about, will these businesses be around? The fatality rates, not just for HCM companies, but for almost any tech startup, are very high. They're well above 80% for companies that don't reach 10 million in revenues. However, on the other side of this, once an HCM company reaches 20 million in revenues, their odds of success increase dramatically. So at our business, Carrick, we closely tracked 400, so not even a third of the 1,400s. There's a lot more work we still need to do. We've spoken directly with about 100 of them, and we've closely evaluated for investment or possibly acquisition 50 of them. But along the way, we've noticed some spectacular blowups, and I'm going to talk about a couple. And I'm not trying to pick on anybody because this is public, but we should just kind of think soberly about this. So Zenefits, some of you may be familiar with Zenefits. It was a US-based HR software business. Basically, they sold software in return for taking over your health insurance. They weren't a health insurance provider, but they effectively became the broker. What wasn't part of their business model is getting a license in all the states that required it. It's basically all 50 states in the US. The founder of this business at the time has raised over $400 million at ultimate valuations that valued the business at about $4 billion. And I remember seeing him on CNBC after that last valuation at $4 billion, saying he was disappointed with the value. And we basically looked at it and said, okay, this is going to mark something that's probably not going to happen well in the market. Anyway, the good news is they've completely changed the business model. It doesn't rely on broker commissions. There's a new management team, and I believe they're making a very good fresh start and growing the company nicely now. There's another business called mypayrollhr.com that hopefully none of you had any business with. But basically, it was a $70 million fraud over a 10-year period. And what's really ultimately worse here is not only were they bad actors, but employees of clients faced outflows of paychecks from their accounts as a result of this business's failure. The CEO and founder was arrested in this business and basically getting his just due, but it's this very sad chapter. So going forward, let's take a closer look at two dynamic areas in payroll. So on demand and international. So what is on demand? This is the premise that an employee doesn't have to wait for payday. This is not a payday alone, but they can get their paychecks every day, every third day. It's very interactive. It's a very dynamic space. You've got small players in there and large players like Ceridian. So we're not putting any of the companies or names up here as a recommendation. We're simply saying this is a space to pay attention to. And then I would also offer multi-country players. Some of you may be familiar with the PEO, Professional Employment Organization. That's now happening on a global basis with the phenomena of co-employment. And then we have global payroll, like our host company, Niamo, one of the leading global payroll providers. But there's a number of other companies in that space too. We think it's a very dynamic and very growing space and something to continue to watch. Now, when I take out my crystal ball, what do we really think here? Machine learning, artificial intelligence is going to have profound impact on talent, payments, and managing a distributed workforce, as well as online learning. So this slide shows our view. This is Carrick's view, not just my view. This is our collective team view of some thoughts where the future takes us in a few areas. I don't have time to go through each of these. And by the way, I'm happy to follow up and chat our thoughts on any of these. But let me talk about a few things that probably would mean something to your business. I'm going to jump around a little bit. So if you look at the middle one, security, awareness, and training. So if we talk about a virtual world, so employees, many of them may not be coming back into the office. They may be working from home. They're going to be working remotely. And when there's an increasing and probably continuing increase in cybersecurity threat, people are going to play a critical role in the overall security and risk posture of the organization. We're all familiar with phishing and what can happen from that. I suspect most of us didn't know that over 40% of data theft from Fortune 500 companies actually comes from employees and internal contractors. There are service providers out there. So the far right, and this is not a comprehensive list, it shows vendors who deal with this problem. So another one I want to touch on here briefly is the whole world of online training and certifications. In some cases, learning is part of human resources. In other organizations, it's not. Either way, we think it's critical. We think the entire concept of a classroom where people went and sat in a class, particularly for adult ongoing learning, even when the world reopens and there's a vaccine rolled out for the virus, is going to have changed forever. There's a number of players, some public, some small, some specialized, growing in this area. And we think that's another area to watch. So I know I've just touched on a little bit of this and scratched the surface. And I'm sure you basically, my hope is it's prompted you to think about things and where HR might take us. But if I could just end with thinking about this, technology is going to be key. Technology is not going to change. And the world of HR as we knew it just 12 months ago is going to be very, very different from the world today. So thanks for your time. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you to the folks at Niamo. This has been great to be able to be part of this discussion. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions over the next couple of days. Thank you.